what is the best exercise over 40? What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through what that looks like, how do you implement it into your life, and what are the little nuances that you might not expect to make sure that we can actually implement this and make sure it's easy to actually do every day. My name's Ollie, I'm from the Meta Project. I'm going to walk you through this process of smarter, more sustainable change. Everyone's playing the quantity game. I want to show you what quality looks like and make sure it lasts forever. Let's dive right in. Where I want to start is getting an awareness of better exercise over 40 and looking at all the pieces of the puzzle when we look at integrative health, psychological, digestive, physical, really bringing it together to look at high quality health and what that conversation really looks like. All right, so we're going to dive right in. So like I said, I want to break it down into physical and trying to make sure we look at one, muscle breakdown. We could look at long-term mobility and maybe something that's a bit different to what you think. And then lastly, recovery, making sure that we're looking a bit more into not just training hard today, but making sure we can still show up better tomorrow. So breaking that down, one of the big things we want to get an awareness of is are you actually able to handle more stress right now? If you're anything like this car absolutely squashed with all the stuff going on, this is what a lot of people feel like, right? It's a classic duck or synchronized swimmer analogy. If everything looks pretty up top, but underneath our feet are paddling like mad. And I think really getting awareness of the stress that a body can actually tolerate and what's going to be productive towards us moving forward is something that we need to have a conversation about, because a lot of us want to get our health back on track, and in order to do it we just shove exercise somewhere into an already stacked day rather than taking the time to really manage whether we can handle or modulate any more stress there. So looking at exercise and making sure we have constructive conversation around what this looks like, we need to look at health before performance, right? We can't just go in and go from sedentary office worker to all black overnight. We need to make sure we look at this as having that health platform to work with and then build from there. Okay, so when we look at recovery, we need to have this conversation of balancing yin versus yang. It's not just a case of more caffeine in the morning to get through the day. We need to make sure that we're managing our night routine in a way that allows us to show up better tomorrow. If we're always just push, then we're building our energy for today or being productive today at the expense of tomorrow, which ultimately we know is in a reactive state and we're not going to be lasting long. So building that balance between yin and yang becomes a really, really nice space. Now, I've just got off a call with some of our new clients joining the Meta Project, and this was a big conversation we had around always on culture, right? Having the discipline to create those boundaries and create an environment where willpower of temptation is not the limiting factor, because willpower will eventually run out. So taking the time to look at those small tweaks we can make around an environment make a really, really big difference, okay? And then the last one here is just a really small statement, which I think for me hits home, is this: the best in the world simply recover harder, right? The people at the top from a professional level aren't necessarily the ones that are training harder and harder. Everybody's training hard, but the ones that are actually getting the results are the ones that know how much more important the recovery is than the actual effort itself, because they can show back up being just as good tomorrow. And when we can take the time to look a bit more into this, exercise becomes so much more enjoyable, we get so much more out of it, and eliciting the response that we're actually after rather than spinning our wheels in the mud. Okay, so the reason this conversation is so helpful or so useful when we're over 40 is because things do certainly work different. Not harder necessarily, but definitely different, right? So from a muscle component, it's definitely harder to maintain or even build muscle tissue. So we need to, even if the goal is not muscle building, we need to make sure we look at maintaining muscle tissue, strength, balance, mobility. All of those things are going to really matter, and making sure that the next 20, 30, 40 years of our life are really at the highest level possible. Because if we don't have a strong, stable base, everything gets harder, right? Second, there's a slower regeneration of cells unless we give it a reason otherwise, right? So we really want to spark back up the system, get things working. There's usually lower hormone production, right? So that's going to really inhibit recovery, and we need to manage what type of training that looks like. And we also got to look at what types of stress we're taking into account. Brain plasticity. Now, we look at this as an obstacle all the time in regards to, old dog not being able to learn new tricks. But when we look at adding in the right type of exercise, we can actually increase that ability to retain information, that ability to maintain some level of or a high level of mental sharpness, of memory, of being able to learn new things. And it's directly correlated to our ability to add in weight training. And then lastly, we see this all over the show, is that decreased range of motion. And what are some components we can look at to keep ourselves strong, balanced, and mobile moving into our later years? So as we break this down and look at this a bit more holistically, we want to make sure that one key component that gets you thinking is effective training comes from being inefficient. And this is a huge part that we talk about in a lot of our workshops, is when we go through a bench press, for example, our body is not naturally going to pin our shoulders back, keep our chest up, and really squeeze our chest to make sure that that one muscle is doing all of the work. It's going to find a way to put it on the shoulders, on the triceps, on any other muscle it can find to get that weight up, which means what we're doing in that space is our body is naturally going to be dispersing that load across as many muscles as possible, which means that we can lift more stuff, but we're not getting a stronger stimulus to that movement. So to be as effective as possible with that one workout, if we've got 10 minutes or we've got 40, it really goes a long way if we really focus on being in control of the muscles contracting rather than just lifting things up and down. Really, really big point, okay? Second part, train the muscle, not the movement. So diving into that intention of focus. What are we actually thinking about when we train a little bit more? Makes a really big difference. Third one, don't burn the candle from both ends. The amount of times that we see people that are stressed out all day, there's lots of stuff going on, and then we go add in a HIIT class or a circuit class and it just stresses the body out more. If our stress has been high all day, we need to look at a couple other things we can do to balance that back out. Maybe lower the stress. How can we add in a walk, yoga, or even just simply getting a different type of stimulus on the body and working more of a central nervous system, looking at going towards a weight training session where we're actually giving ourselves a good amount of rest in between, but it's not all high heart rate stuff and keeping us in a really high stress space. Making those adjustments, certainly as we get into our 40s and 50s, make a significant difference to still getting results from the effort we're putting in. It's just a different type of effort. And then the last one here is a lot of people have this conversation around, what percentages of nutrition and training, but I think a bigger part of this conversation is when we dive into the bigger picture of health, it's really starting to integrate, are we absorbing the food we're eating? Are we stressed out all day, and is more weight training actually going to be beneficial to this process, right? And really starting to look into the bigger components of health, realize that there's more pieces to the puzzle, but we do need to make sure that our recovery component is taken into account before we go beat ourselves up with training. This is a big part that I think that is missed, is we start to go back to workouts that used to work when we were 20, right? We start to go for a run, we go back to a sport, and everything just starts to ache and really feel terrible. When we are working with this new biology and we ultimately are working with a whole new system, we do need to make sure we're looking at this with a new fresh pair of eyes, right? How much exercise should I be doing? Well, if I did 0 last week, 1's a really great place to start. Don't go back to 6, right? So build it up slowly, find that 1%. What types of exercise are you doing? So rather than it being really jolty and jarring on the joints, what are some things we can do to get more effective muscle contraction, but less damage to the actual joints and ligaments themselves, right? It really starts to have this conversation of longevity. And thirdly, is this something I still want to be doing in 20 years? And if it is, how can I make sure that I keep doing it? And this is a really, really important point, because it's not necessarily the weight training, for example, that I'm alluding to that could potentially be helpful towards that longevity component. It's how the weight training is going to allow you to show up better for the mountain biking, for the running, whatever other things that you want to do. It doesn't necessarily have to be the weight training itself, but it becomes a really core component of making sure all those other things feel better. All right, and that's really where the key difference is the association of why you're doing it, rather than necessarily having to like the thing itself. You can like the thing itself, that helps too, but it's a really nice place to start. The next part I want to touch on just briefly, guys, is this mobility versus flexibility, and understanding there's a really, really big difference between just a range of motion and actually being in control there. When we talked about this before, we looked at addressing, if we're going through a chest press, for example, our body's naturally going to disperse it across multiple muscles. Now, if we're really weak in our chest and we're really over-dominant in our shoulders, which is really, really common if we're used to using our hands day to day, or simply we're not using our chest, just more common, we are more likely to put more of that tension on those bigger muscles, like our shoulders, or the more dominant muscles, right? And the muscles that are weak will continue to stay weak. And what that does over time is it causes more and more imbalances. We start to see our shoulders all roll forward. We start to see our neck get really tight. We start to see our lower back tweaking the whole time. And all of those small adjustments we can make to simply bring back contraction of the muscles that are not working starts to really change the conversation, rather than going to a manual therapist like a massage or a physio or an acupuncturist. Those things are still great, but if they're the only way to make you feel good, there's something else missing. How can we actually proactively build that strength back in the muscles that are constantly not working, rather than trying to find the other ones that are overworking all the time that you're trying to release, right? Really big switch in mindset. How can we look after your body by building up the muscles that are weak, rather than constantly releasing the muscles that are tight? Right? They're tight because they're overactive, they're overworking because these other little buddies aren't helping out, right? Really big shift in how we look at movement and how we look at building back a proactive space of training. The next one I want to touch on, guys, is looking at longevity through movement. So I've already touched on this a little bit, but when we're understanding that it becomes about better muscle contraction, we start to realize that when we're adding in cardio, although there's so many other benefits, and I'm not saying don't do your run or bike if you really enjoy that space, and aerobically that's still going to be something that would be really, really helpful. The one thing we're trying to take into account here is it's still a very low level of muscle contraction. There's still a really, really inefficient use of our time if our goal is keeping ourselves in shape body composition wise, right? If our goal is to be really great at running, then keep running. But trying to make sure we look at from a body composition level, or even necessarily the longevity of the running, doing the contraction resistance based work, home or gym, doesn't have to be in a gym, can allow you to really build that back up. All right, so looking at that muscle over movement component and how can I get as effective muscle contractions of muscles in my body rather than damaging joints and ligaments goes a really, really long way. All right, the last one here that I've written down the bottom that says, I'll underline it for you, is if we look at that flexibility versus mobility, is this significant shift starts to look at if we just stretch a muscle all the time, we're passively stretching into that range, right? But we have no strength there. So our ability to look to get into a certain position and then contract out of it is really where we want to look at when we're building back balance and strength. So allowing our focus to be on the muscle and contracting things just allows us to make sure that it's a usable range we can actually work with, rather than just stretching into a position that feels like I'm stretching, I'm relaxing a muscle, I'm not strengthening or benefiting that long term other than the 10 seconds I'm stretching it. So looking at contraction and building back that balance and integrity of a joint allows us to make sure that we're feeling good, our body's functioning the way it should. All right. And the last thing I want to really touch on, just as a final point here, guys, is that do you still enjoy it, right? Are you progressing right now? Are you still seeing your training move in the right direction? Or are you hoping, right? Is it something that you're just going through the motions, you're not getting the results, but it's something that used to work and it's better than nothing, so you're just continuing to hope it's doing something? Hopefully from today's conversation, what we're communicating is that there is no reason to take the foot off the gas pedal. What we're telling you to do is simply shift what vehicle you're initially driving in so you can get the results. If you're battling against yourself, you feel run down, you feel sluggish, you feel worn out, and you just feel like you're spinning your tires in the mud, there's simply a shift in process around what are some new things that I need to learn, what are some new skills that I need to understand about this new biology, about how that training might look. Once I go through learning that contraction, what that looks like at making it an effective workout again, then things start to become more enjoyable. You start to see your body respond, your energy improves, your recovery's there. You're not constantly fatigued and flat and never looking forward to the next workout, because we can start to build that structure and progress back into space. So hopefully today gave you a couple of thoughts around weight training, what it looks like to add that back into your life. And it doesn't have to be the classic 3 days a week training chest and arms. It's a process of building up the muscles that are weak, posterior chain, back muscles, all of the ones that are usually underactive from our day-to-day lives, where we're sitting in a chair, where even potentially from the sports we're doing and the imbalances that come from that. I rode for 5 years, so I kind of came out of rowing slightly sideways, right? So balancing those things out and making sure our body works and works for a long time is starting to be a much more and smarter conversation about long-term health and how our body can come along for the ride. Because there's nothing worse than hip surgery and knee surgery and things constantly creaking and popping the whole time. How can we make sure that we still feel good? Hopefully that gave you a couple of things to think about. If you ever want to dive a little bit deeper into this, please let me know. I'm more than welcome to go through this process a little bit. There's a couple more videos probably on this page that we will go through a little bit deeper as well. And hopefully today gave you a couple of thoughts to chew on that are beneficial to keeping your body long, strong, lean, and making the most of the next 20, 30, 40 odd years. I hope you have an incredible week, guys. I hope that was helpful and look forward to talking to you soon.